Her stepson did not raise his voice. His name was Frank, and his primary virtue, as he saw it, was a complete lack of sentiment. He stood on the porch of the house her husband had built, his hands resting on his hips in a posture of placid ownership. He explained the situation with the calm of a man discussing crop rotation. The deed, since his father's passing, was in his name. A family from Ohio had made an offer on the full 200 acres, a good offer, and he had accepted it. He had the papers. She would have until noon to gather her personal effects. The term personal effects was delivered with a clinical precision that precluded any argument about what it might encompass. The house was not a personal effect. The barn was not. The 40 years she had poured into the soil, turning it from unbroken prairie into a productive farm, were not. Agnes, at 70 years of age, listened without speaking. There was no point in speaking to a man who had already rehearsed his logic and found it flawless. She had seen this same dispassionate certainty in her own husband when he decided to leave Missouri, a place her mother, a woman of the Osage Nation, had refused to abandon once she heard the words Kansas and prairie used in the same sentence. He had simply announced the decision, and that had been the end of it. Frank was his father's son. She nodded once, a short, sharp motion, and turned back into the house. Her inventory was swift. She took the heavy wool blanket from her bed, the one woven with a deep indigo stripe. She took the cast iron skillet, its surface seasoned to a black mirror. A small tin of lard, a half-full sack of flour. From a locked chest, she retrieved the deerskin pouch her mother had given her on her wedding day. Inside was a little over 3 pounds of precious seed corn, each kernel a different shade of amber and red, saved from a line that had been in their family for generations, and a handful of dried beans. She took her husband's whetstone, its surface worn into a gentle curve, and a single tin cup. The cup had been hers since childhood. She placed these items onto the blanket, folded the corners, and tied it into a tight bundle. Frank watched her from the porch, his expression unchanging. He did not offer help, nor did he obstruct her. He was simply waiting for noon. At 1:45, Agnes walked out of the house, the bundle slung over her shoulder. She did not look at him. She walked past the barn, past the smokehouse, past the fields that were just beginning to show the green of new corn. She walked to the section road and turned south. She chose south for one reason: it led away from settled land, toward the unclaimed quarter sections that no one else had wanted. The sun was high and hot on her back. Her braid, still thick but now the color of milkweed silk, lay between her shoulder blades. She walked with a steady, ground-eating stride, the stride of a woman who understood that situations did not change, only one's response to them. She did not look back. The claim she found was a quarter section of unpromising land 4 miles south. A previous attempt at settlement lay slumped in the middle of it, a small soddy, its roof partially collapsed, its door a dark, gaping hole. The land around it was mostly buffalo grass and thistle, with a shallow, rock-strewn creek bed bisecting the western edge. The well, when she found it under a tangle of wild grape, was little more than a stone-lined pit half filled with stagnant water and dead leaves. It was land that had already defeated one family. For Agnes, it was enough. The first week was spent on shelter. She pulled the collapsed sod blocks from the interior of the dwelling, resetting them into the walls. She used her hands and a sharpened stick to dig fresh sod from the prairie, cutting it into heavy bricks to patch the roof. The work was slow and punishing. The muscles in her lower back and shoulders, accustomed to the rhythms of an established farm, had opinions about this new arrangement, but she chose not to listen to them. She thatched the roof with a thick layer of slough grass cut from the creek bed, creating a dense, water-resistant mat. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of damp earth. She built a small fire pit near the door, lining it with stones. At night, she slept on the hard-packed floor, wrapped in her wool blanket, the skillet and her sack of seed corn beside her. The second week was for water. She baled the old well dry with her tin cup, a task that took 2 full days. Then, using the same sharpened stick and her bare hands, she began to dig, loosening the hard-packed clay and hauling it out cup by cup. She dug until her fingernails were broken and her arms burned with a steady, deep ache. She went down another 4 feet before the water began to seep back in, this time clear and cold. She lined the new depth with more stones, and the well was done. Survival became a spare mathematics. She ate foraged lamb's quarters and wild onion, supplemented by the occasional rabbit she was able to snare. The flour was used sparingly, to make a thin, flat bread cooked on a hot stone. The lard was for the skillet. The corn, the precious Osage corn, was untouchable. It was not food, it was a future. Every morning she worked the land, and every evening she sharpened her digging stick with her husband's whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone the only sound besides the wind. She was marking time, building a life from nothing but dirt and her own endurance, waiting for the moment she could walk to the land office and pay the fee to make the claim officially hers. In the 3rd week of May, she broke the sod for her garden. This was the hardest work of all. The prairie root systems were a dense, tangled mat that fought back against her spade, a flat stone she had sharpened and lashed to a stick. She worked in a small, 10 by 20 foot plot near the soddy, turning over the heavy earth 1 square at a time. By the end of each day, her hands were raw and her body felt like a single, solid bruise. She was 70 years old, and the prairie did not care. Into this grudging soil, she planted her mother's corn in small mounds, placing a single bin beside each kernel as she had been taught. The beans would climb the stalks, and their roots would fix nitrogen in the soil, feeding the corn. It was a partnership, an ancient and efficient system. She planted a few hills of wild squash from seeds she had saved from the previous year. These were the crops she knew, the ones that grew toward the sun. Her resources were finite: 3 pounds of corn, a handful of beans, a few squash seeds. It was a small gamble, but it was all she had. If the harvest was good, she would have enough to eat, enough to sell for the filing fee, and enough seed to plant a larger plot the following year. If it failed, she would not survive the winter. One afternoon, a woman appeared at the edge of her plot. She was tall and raw-boned, with hands as worn as Agnes's own. She introduced herself as Martha, the widow from the next section over. She watched Agnes work for a long time, her eyes taking in the small plot, the repaired soddy, the determined set of Agnes's shoulders. She said nothing about Frank or the old farm, though the news had surely traveled. "That's a hard piece of land," Martha said finally, her voice dry as dust. "All land is hard," Agnes replied, not breaking her rhythm. Martha nodded, a gesture of understanding that needed no further words. She left as quietly as she had come. The next morning, Agnes found a small burlap sack sitting by her door. Inside were 24 potato eyes, already beginning to sprout, and a handful of turnip seeds. There was no note. Agnes looked toward the north, where Martha's claim lay, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She cleared another, smaller plot for the gift, a patch of ground closer to the soddy. She planted the potato eyes deep and scattered the tiny turnip seeds, covering them with a thin layer of soil. It felt strange to be planting these humble, hidden things. Her life had always been measured by what grew upward, the height of the corn, the reach of the bin vines. This was something different. By July, her main plot was thriving. The corn stood 5 feet high, its tassels a pale gold. The beans had twined their way up the stalks, and the broad, dark green leaves of the squash vines covered the ground between the mounds. The prairie sun and a few timely rains had been kind. It was going to be enough. The sky began to change on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. The brilliant, empty blue of the Kansas summer horizon turned a strange, bruised bronze along the western edge. It was not the color of a storm. It moved like water, a slow, shimmering curtain advancing across the prairie. Then came the sound. It was not thunder. It was a dry, collective clicking, a sound made of a million tiny parts that grew from a distant whisper into a rasping roar that filled the air. Agnes had heard stories of the locusts, but the stories were thin things compared to the reality. The swarm blotted out the sun. The world went from bright afternoon to a dim, metallic twilight in the space of minutes. The air grew thick with them, a storm of living bodies that collided with the walls of the soddy and clung to her clothes. They were everywhere, a moving, clicking, devouring carpet. She stood in the doorway of her home and watched them descend on her garden. The destruction was not chaotic, it was methodical, efficient, and absolute. They started with the tender leaves at the top of the cornstalks, and in a wave, they moved downward. The broad squash leaves vanished as if dissolving, shredded into nothingness in seconds. The bean vines were stripped bare, leaving only fibrous, denuded strings clinging to the corn. They ate the corn itself, chewing through the husks to get to the soft, milky kernels. They ate until all that remained of her garden were skeletal, pale green stalks pointing at a sky that was no longer visible. They were not content with the crops. They consumed the prairie grass, leaving behind patches of bare, chewed earth. They landed on the roof of the soddy and ate the thatch of slough grass, there chewing a deafening, constant static. The wool blanket she had hung over the doorway as a makeshift door was attacked next. They clung to it, their mandibles working relentlessly, and by the time the main swarm moved on, all that was left was a ghost hem of thread still caught on the wooden pegs. They ate the leather wrapping on the handle of her digging tool. For 2 days the swarm passed over, a river of hunger that scoured the landscape clean. When it was over, the silence was more shocking than the noise had been. The sun returned, shining down on a world that had been stripped to its bones. Every farm in the county, every field, every garden, was gone. The collective hope of a season's work had been erased in 48 hours. The prairie was a monochrome desert of brown stems and bare dirt. Agnes did not weep. She had not wept when her husband died, nor when her stepson had told her to leave. Grief was a luxury, a fire that consumed energy she did not have. Instead, she walked out into the silence and the stark sunlight and began to observe. She went first to the main plot, the place of her greatest hope. She ran her hand along a stripped cornstalk. It was brittle and dry, a hollowed-out monument to what had been. The beans were gone. The squash, which had promised a dozen heavy fruits, was reduced to a few gnawed rinds melting into the soil. The ground itself was pocked and disturbed, covered in the droppings of the swarm. It was a total loss. There was nothing to salvage, nothing to save. The future she had been building here was as gone as the leaves on the stalks. She stood there for a long time, not in mourning, but in assessment. This was a fact. Like the hardness of the soil or the lack of rain, it was a condition to be understood, not lamented. Then she turned and walked to the smaller plot, the one near the soddy where she had planted Martha's gift. The scene above ground was just as bleak. The potato vines had been eaten down to nubs. The broad, green tops of the turnips were gone completely. To the eye, this plot was as ruined as the other. But this was a different kind of crop. Agnes went back to the soddy and returned with her spade. She chose a spot where a potato vine had been and pushed the sharpened stone into the earth. The soil was dry and compacted, but she put her weight into it. The stone scraped against something solid. She dug around it, loosening the dirt, and then reached down and pulled. A perfect, smooth-skinned potato, the size of her fist, came out of the ground. It was dense and heavy in her hand. It was untouched. She dug again, a few feet away where the turnips had been. She unearthed a large, purple-topped turnip, its white flesh gleaming in the sun. She dug for an hour, moving methodically through the small plot. She uncovered every potato, every turnip. They were all there, safe beneath the surface, protected by the one thing the locusts could not penetrate, the earth itself. Later that day, Martha arrived, her face a mask of weary resignation. "They took it all," she said. It was not a question. Agnes, who was sitting by her door cleaning the dirt from a potato, did not look up immediately. She finished her task and then held the potato out in her palm. Not all. Martha stared at the potato, then at the pile of them beside Agnes. A slow understanding dawned in her eyes. "They eat what they can see," Martha stated, the words a flat summary of the catastrophe. Agnes met her gaze, her own eyes clear and direct. "Then I will grow what they cannot see." The decision, once made, settled into a period of immense and calculated labor. Agnes was not merely planting a different crop, she was designing an entirely new system, an agriculture of inversion. Her previous garden had been an appeal to the sky, for sun, for rain. This new one would be a conversation with the earth. She abandoned the concept of rows. Rows were for things that reached upward, that needed equal access to light. Her new crops needed depth. She began by digging trenches. They were 2 feet wide and, eventually, 3 feet deep. The work was brutal, far harder than breaking the initial sod. She was moving tons of earth with nothing but her sharpened stone spade and her own body. Each shovelful of the dense lower clay was a victory. She dug 4 of these trenches, each 30 feet long, running parallel to each other. The excavated soil piled up in long berms between them. Her days fell into a simple, punishing rhythm: dig, haul, rest, repeat. She ate from her small store of harvested potatoes and turnips, rationing them carefully. They were both her sustenance and the seed for her future. She filled the bottom foot of each trench with rocks and gravel from the creek bed, a laborious process of carrying them 1 bucketful at a miscellaneous. This was for drainage, to prevent the roots from rotting in the deep soil. Above the gravel, she layered organic matter. She gathered dried prairie grass, cattails from the creek, and fallen leaves, tramping them down to create a thick, spongy layer that would hold moisture and slowly decompose, releasing nutrients. She mixed the excavated topsoil with ash from her fire pit and burned manure she collected from the open range, creating a rich, dark loam. She filled the trenches with this amended soil, creating raised beds that were intensely fertile and deep. From the surface, her new farm looked strange. It was not a field but a series of long, low mounds of dark earth and mulch. It looked more like a burial ground than a place of cultivation. Into these beds, she planted her entire stock of saved potatoes and turnips. She traded Martha 6 potatoes for a handful of carrot and parsnip seeds, which she planted in a dedicated bed of their own. She then covered the entire area with a thick, 6-inch layer of prairie hay. This mulch would protect the soil from the baking summer sun, suppress weeds, and conserve every drop of moisture. She was building a self-contained ecosystem, a fortress of soil designed to protect its treasure from the world above. Her body protested this new level of exertion. Her joints ached constantly, and some mornings she had to consciously uncurl her hands from the stiff claws they had become overnight. But the work itself was a form of thought. With every spadeful of earth, she was refining her argument against the sky. She was betting everything on a single, simple observation: what is hidden is protected. The following summer arrived with a nervous, watchful energy. Agnes's new farm was established. From a distance, it was unimpressive. The potato leaves were healthy but low to the ground. The feathery tops of the carrots and the broad leaves of the turnips barely crested the thick layer of hay mulch. It did not look like a place of abundance. It looked quiet, unassuming, and half-hidden. Elsewhere in the county, farmers had replanted, cautiously. Fields of young corn, barely knee-high, stood in hopeful green rows under the vast sky. They were gambling on the belief that a catastrophe of that magnitude could not happen 2 years in a row. In early July, the rumors began. Travelers from the west spoke of another swarm, smaller than the great one of 1874, but significant. A week later, the rumors became fact. The metallic shimmer appeared on the western horizon again. A collective dread settled over the territory. On the day the swarm arrived, Agnes did not panic. She did not try to cover her plants. Her work was already done. The defense was the system itself. She stood by the door of her soddy and watched the sky darken. The familiar, terrifying clicking filled the air. The swarm was smaller, the sky still visible through the shifting clouds of insects, but it was dense enough to do its work. They descended on the neighboring farms, on the tender shoots of new corn. She could see the wave of destruction move across the landscape, the green fields turning brown in its wake. Then they came to her claim. They swarmed over her plot, a chaotic, clicking blanket. They landed on the tough, hairy potato leaves and the turnip greens. They nibbled at them, but it was not the easy feast of the year before. There was less for them to grasp, less tender foliage. They crawled over the thick hay mulch, finding it unapalatable and difficult to navigate. The main meal, the dense, starchy tubers and roots that were swelling in the cool, dark earth beneath, was completely inaccessible. It was a fortress they could not breach. There was simply not enough reward for the effort. After an hour of fruitless searching, the bulk of the swarm lifted, moving east in search of more vulnerable fields. A few stragglers remained, but the great river of hunger had passed her by. The test was over. Her theory had held. The quiet, hidden farm had survived. She stood in the silence after they had gone, the air thick with the smell of bruised leaves, and looked at her beds. They were a little ragged, but they were intact. The real harvest was safe, sleeping in the dark. The aftermath of the second swarm was a landscape of discouraging repetition. The neighboring fields of corn were severely damaged, the stalks stripped and the young ears gnawed. It was not the total annihilation of the previous year, but for many, it was a finishing blow to their finances and their morale. Agnes's plot, by contrast, looked nearly untouched. A few chewed leaves, a scattering of insect casings on the mulch, but the plants themselves were alive and healthy. She waited 2 more weeks, letting the roots swell and sweeten in the earth, and then she began the harvest. This was the moment of truth, the final accounting of her radical experiment. She started with the potatoes. Plunging her hands deep into the loose, rich soil of the raised beds was a revelation. The earth gave way easily, no hardpan clay to fight. The potatoes were not clustered near the surface but were arranged all through the deep loam, large, clean-skinned, and numerous. She pulled plant after plant, and each one yielded a cascade of tubers. It was a level of productivity she had never seen in 40 years of conventional farming. She began to keep a tally, weighing the produce on a simple balance scale she had constructed from a plank and a rope, using stones of a known weight as a counterbalance. The numbers grew, and with them, the quiet, irrefutable proof of her success. The final count was staggering for such a small plot. From the first bed, she harvested 412 pounds of potatoes. The turnips came next, huge and perfectly formed, their flesh sweet and crisp. They weighed in at 218 pounds. The carrots were long and straight, not forked or stunted by hard soil, a deep, vibrant orange. There were 97 pounds. The parsnips, which she left in the ground until the first frost to sweeten them, eventually yielded another 88 pounds. In total, from a garden that looked like almost nothing from the surface, she had harvested over 800 pounds of dense, nutritious food. She spent a week digging a proper root cellar into the side of a small rise behind the soddy, lining it with stones and building a thick, insulated door. She filled it with her bounty, a subterranean treasury secured against the coming winter. She had enough to eat, enough to sell, and more than enough seed for the following year. She had faced the apocalypse and answered it by digging deeper. The following market day, Agnes loaded a small handcart with 100 pounds of her finest potatoes and turnips and walked the 4 miles to the small town that served the county. The mood at the market was grim. The few farmers who had anything to sell offered scrawny, locust-damaged squash and a few baskets of late-season greens. Most stalls were empty, their owners standing with the defeated air of people who had nothing to offer. Then Agnes arrived. She set up her small stall and began to pile it high with her produce. The potatoes were large, smooth, and perfect. The turnips were round and heavy, their purple tops glowing. Compared to the meager offerings around her, her stall was an island of impossible abundance. At first, people simply stared. They walked past, slowed, and looked at her vegetables as if they were a mirage. They could not reconcile the sight of this bounty with the ruin of their own fields. "Where did these come from?" one man asked, picking up a potato that weighed nearly 2 pounds. "My land," Agnes said simply. The first sales were slow, driven by sheer necessity. But as people tasted the quality of the food, a new energy took hold. A woman bought 5 pounds of potatoes, then came back 10 minutes later for 20 more. Word spread through the small market. The woman on the abandoned claim, the old woman living in the soddy, had a harvest. A crowd formed around her stall. She sold out in less than 2 hours. The money she collected, crisp notes and heavy coins, was enough to pay the homestead filing fee 3 times over. But it was the following week that marked the real change. They did not just come to the market to buy. They came to her. A few farmers at first, then more, walking the dusty track to her claim. They stood at the edge of her strange-looking garden, at the low, mulched mounds, and tried to understand. She did not lecture. She showed them. She dug into a bed and showed them the deep, rich soil. She explained the layers, the mulch, the logic of depth. One of the visitors was Abram, a Mennonite farmer from the north side of the county, a man known for his quiet wisdom. He crumbled the dark soil in his hands and looked at the deep trenches. He nodded slowly, a deep and ancient recognition in his eyes. "My grandmother in the old country," he said, his voice soft, his German accent shaping the words. She spoke of this. Against the drought, against the lean years. They called it Grub Betanbau. Trench bed growing. He looked directly at Agnes, his respect clear. You grew what they could not see. That is the only kind of growing that lasts. Agnes lived on that claim for another 15 years. She walked to the land office the week after that first market day and filed her claim, paying the fee in full. The clerk, a young man with a thin mustache, looked at her calloused hands and the earth still ground into the lines of her palms. "You are filing alone?" he asked, his pen hovering over the ledger. "I am," she said. The word settled in the quiet office, a statement of fact that needed no embellishment. Her method, which the locals came to call the below-ground way, began to spread. It did not replace the fields of corn and wheat, the cash crops were still king. But her system became a form of essential insurance. On nearly every farm in the county, a small, deep-bedded plot of root vegetables was established near the house, the harvest that could not be taken by the sky. Agnes never sought students, but they came to her. She taught by doing, showing visitors how to dig the trenches, how to layer the compost, how to apply the mulch. Her payment was never in cash, but in traded goods, a side of bacon, a bolt of cloth, a new handle for her spade. She remained on her quarter section, her life pared down to a series of essential, satisfying rhythms. She never expanded her garden beyond what she could work herself. Her needs were simple, and the earth provided them. Martha passed away in the winter of 1884. Her children brought Agnes a small, sealed envelope. Inside was a note, written in a shaky but clear hand. It contained only one sentence: "You showed us the way down." Agnes folded the note carefully and placed it inside the tin cup on the shelf above her bed. The cup was never used for drinking, its purpose was to hold the evidence of the one friendship that had asked for nothing and understood everything. The story of Agnes became a piece of the land itself, a tale told to children on winter nights. She was the woman who looked at a sky filled with ruin and chose to place her faith not in prayer, but in the dirt. Her victory was never celebrated with a monument of stone. It was written in the dark, rich soil of the garden she inspired, in the cellars full of potatoes and carrots that guarded against the uncertainties of the prairie. The men and women who came after learned from her that the truest wealth is not what you display for the world to see, but what you have the wisdom to protect.